I built my dream tennis court, only to have my HOA steal it from me. They let everyone use it, except me. Then, I found out the truth. They weren't just greedy. They were corrupt. Millions stolen, fake invoices, illegal fines, and guess who got assigned as their government auditor? They had no idea I was about to destroy them. Flashed to HOA President Karen's shocked face as documents slam onto the table. Watch till the end, because this revenge, oh, it's good. It had always been my dream to own a house with a private tennis court. When I finally found the perfect property, a beautiful home tucked away in a quiet suburban neighborhood, I felt like I had won the lottery. The previous owner had built a tennis court for his daughter, a former college-level player, but after she moved out, it sat mostly unused. I wasn't much of a player myself, but I appreciated the luxury of having a personal space, untouched and truly mine. For months after moving in, life was peaceful. I'd occasionally go out in the evenings, beer in hand, to admire the court under the floodlights. It felt like a piece of paradise, until one day it didn't. It started subtly. A tennis ball appeared near my back fence. I assumed some kids had accidentally tossed it over. Then, I noticed footprints on the court one morning. I chalked it up to curiosity from the neighborhood kids. But then one afternoon, I pulled into my driveway and saw two strangers, middle-aged women in tennis skirts, casually rallying on my court. I got out of the car, staring in disbelief. They hadn't even noticed me. "Excuse me," I called out, keeping my voice firm. "What are you doing?" The women turned, startled but not embarrassed. One of them, a woman with short, frosted hair and a condescending smirk, wiped her forehead. "Oh, we were just finishing up a match. Don't mind us." That was the first red flag. They acted like they belonged there. "You do realize this is private property, right?" I said, stepping closer. The smirk didn't fade. If anything, it grew wider. "Oh, you must be new. The HOA allows members to use the tennis court," she explained like she was talking to a child. "It's a community amenity." I frowned. "No, it's not. This is my court. It's on my property. I'm not part of the HOA. Her face twitched, but she quickly recovered. "Well, that's just how it's always been. The previous owner let us use it. So it's kind of tradition." A tradition? Was she serious? "I don't care what the previous owner allowed. I own the property now, and no one uses this court without my permission." That's when the real trouble started. The next morning, I woke up to an unwelcome sight. A laminated HOA community rules sign was zip-tied to my tennis court fence. It was full of ridiculous rules. Proper tennis attire required. No pets on the court. Court hours, 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. A sinking feeling settled in my gut. Someone was trying to establish authority over my property. I grabbed the sign, ripped it down, and stormed back inside. Before I could even cool down, I heard the rhythmic thumping of a tennis ball. I rushed to my backyard, and, sure enough, two more people were playing on my court, a different pair this time. Fury bubbled inside me. I marched over. "What the hell are you doing?" I snapped. They turned unfazed. "Oh, we booked the court for 10 a.m., one of them said. "Booked." The other man, casually dressed in a polo and tennis shorts, checked his watch. "Yeah, Karen said she put us down for an hour." Karen, that must have been frosted hair, lady from yesterday. "Karen doesn't own this property." "I do," I said sharply. "Get out, now." They hesitated, muttering something about how they'd check with Karen, but eventually left. That evening, I installed a heavy-duty lock on the gate. I wasn't going to deal with trespassers, but the war was just beginning. The following morning, I heard an angry knocking on my door. Through the peephole, I saw Karen, arms crossed, HOA badge clipped to her polo shirt. I took a deep breath and opened the door. "Morning," I said flatly. "What do you think you're doing?" she snapped, pointing toward the backyard. "Several people told me you put a lock on our tennis court." I folded my arms. "You mean my tennis court?" She scoffed. "That's not how it works. The HOA has an agreement with the previous owner. That agreement ended when I bought the house. It's private property." Her face turned red. You're being unreasonable. The court has been open to HOA members for years. Everyone is used to it. That's not my problem, I said, keeping my voice even. If someone trespasses again, I'll call the police. Karen's lips pursed into a tight line. We'll see about that. That was the moment I knew. She wasn't going to back down. The retaliation came swiftly. 2 days later, I received a notice of violation in my mailbox from the HOA. It claimed I was violating community standards by improperly restricting access to a shared amenity. The letter included a fine of $250 for my unauthorized modification of the tennis court. I nearly laughed. I called the number listed on the notice and was greeted by a robotic HOA representative. After several transfers, I finally got Karen on the line. This is harassment, I said. She was unfazed. You're part of the HOA. You need to follow the rules. I never signed up for the HOA. She made an exaggerated sigh. Your property falls under the HOA's jurisdiction, whether you like it or not. I clenched my jaw. You can't fine me for something that's legally mine. Then take it up with the board, she said smugly. Hanging up, that's when I knew I needed to dig deeper. I spent the next few nights digging into property records, HOA bylaws, and legal precedents. The deeper I went, the more I realized something didn't add up. The HOA didn't actually own my property. There was no legally binding agreement tying me to the association. The previous owner had only given verbal permission for court use. That meant nothing legally. The HOA had a history of disputes. Several homeowners had fought and won cases against them before. Then I found the golden ticket. In my research, I discovered that HOAs were subject to financial audits and legal oversight, and that their books were reviewed by local government auditors. And that's when fate stepped in. A friend of mine, Greg, worked in the local government auditing office. On a hunch, I reached out and asked if he'd ever come across anything strange about my neighborhood's HOA. His response? Actually, yeah, their finances have been flagged for review. And that's when I realized I had a way to fight back. I wasn't surprised when the next wave of retaliation came. 2 days after my call with Greg, I woke up to an orange sticker plastered on my front door. Violation notice. Failure to maintain lawn per HOA standards. I frowned. My lawn was immaculate. I took care of it myself, mowing it every Sunday like clockwork. But that wasn't the point, was it? The HOA was escalating. I took the notice down and went to my mailbox. Inside, I found another fine, $500 this time. For what? Failure to comply with HOA amenity access rules. I clenched my fists. They were fabricating violations, trying to force me into submission. That evening, I decided to go for a walk around the neighborhood, my phone in hand, recording. Sure enough, I found at least 3 houses with lawns worse than mine. Overgrown hedges, weeds, even a broken-down car sitting on one driveway. But there were no violation notices on those doors. Just mine. The message was clear. They were targeting me. What they didn't know was that I wasn't going to back down. The next morning, I met Greg for coffee at a local diner. He slid a folder across the table. I pulled some preliminary reports on your HOA, he said in a low voice. Something is way off. I opened the folder, scanning through the documents. My stomach tightened. The HOA was sitting on tens of thousands of dollars in maintenance fees, but there were barely any records showing where that money was going. I flipped another page and saw a $15,000 payment listed under community enhancements. Do you know what that was for? Greg asked, watching my reaction. I did. It was the same amount Karen had bragged about spending on a new community garden during our last argument. There was just one problem. There was no new community garden. I sat back, exhaling. This is fraud. Greg nodded. And if I had to guess, your HOA president is at the center of it. I smirked. Then it's time to make her sweat. I needed more evidence before making my move. I started attending HOA meetings, sitting quietly in the back. Karen's face twitched every time she saw me. I asked pointed questions about the finances. What's the HOA's annual budget for maintenance? How much did the tennis court renovations cost last year? I could see Karen growing more and more agitated. She never gave straight answers. A few days later, I filed an official records request demanding to see itemized financial reports. Under local law, HOAs were required to provide this information within 10 business days. Karen's response? A flat-out refusal. I sent a copy of that refusal straight to Greg's office. That's when the real trouble started. A week later, Greg called me with something I never expected. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "We just got assigned a full-scale audit of your HOA." I grinned. Perfect timing. "It gets better," Greg continued. "They needed someone to conduct the initial review." I paused, and he let the words hang for a moment. Then he said the magic sentence. "We assigned it to you." I nearly dropped my phone. I was now the auditor overseeing my HOA's finances. The irony was too good to be true. The very people who had tried to bully me into submission had unknowingly put me in a position of absolute power over them, and I had no intention of being merciful. I spent the next few days poring over every document the HOA had ever filed, and what I found was worse than I imagined. Fake invoices. The HOA had billed residents for community services that were never provided. Personal spending. Karen had used HOA funds for what appeared to be luxury vacations and personal shopping sprees. Kickback schemes. A landscaping company was receiving overinflated payments, and it just so happened to be owned by Karen's brother-in-law. I compiled everything into a dossier. Then I made a decision. I scheduled a meeting with Karen. When I walked into the HOA office, Karen was sitting behind her desk, looking smug, until she saw the official audit paperwork in my hand. Her face paled. "We need to talk," I said, shutting the door behind me. "What is this?" she asked, barely holding on to her composure. I set the thick folder of evidence in front of her. "This is the beginning of the end." She flipped through the pages, her hands shaking. You can't just accuse me of..." "Oh, I'm not accusing you of anything," I interrupted. "The state auditor's office is..." Her breath hitched. "Here's what's going to happen," I continued, leaning forward. "You're going to step down. Immediately. You're going to return every dime you stole." I tapped a specific page in the file. "Or I'll make sure you go to prison." She swallowed hard. I had her, but the fight wasn't over yet. Karen stared at the stack of damning evidence before her. The color had drained from her face, her usually confident demeanor crumbling. "You don't have the authority to do this," she stammered, trying to muster some of her usual arrogance. I smirked, leaning forward. "Actually, I do, as the assigned auditor for this case. I can report my findings directly to the State Financial Board, and once I do, they'll have everything they need to launch a full-scale investigation." Her hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. "You've been stealing from this community. Karen, years of fraud, fake invoices, kickbacks, personal vacations disguised as community projects. All of it leads back to you." She shook her head, panic flashing in her eyes. I didn't. I slid a copy of a $15,000 landscaping invoice toward her. "This company?" I tapped the paper. "Your brother-in-law owns it. And yet, there's no record of any actual work being done." She swallowed hard. I leaned back, watching her squirm. "I'd start thinking about an exit strategy if I were you," I said, standing up, "because once this goes public, you won't just lose your position. You'll be lucky to avoid a prison sentence." Karen didn't respond, but I could see the wheels turning. She wasn't going to go down without a fight, and I was ready for whatever she had planned. The next morning, my phone buzzed with notification from the HOA email system. "Emergency board meeting. Immediate attendance required." I knew what this was. Karen was making one last desperate move, trying to rally her remaining allies on the HOA board to protect herself. I arrived at the meeting to find the usual suspects seated at the long conference table. Karen sat at the head, her expression neutral, but her knuckles white as she gripped a pen. As soon as I sat down, she cleared her throat. "We have some serious accusations being thrown around," she began, forcing a calm tone. "And I think it's time we discuss removing unnecessary interference in our community's affairs." I raised an eyebrow. "You mean me?" She gave a tight smile. We're proposing a vote to ban non-board members from interfering in HOA finances. I almost laughed. She was trying to push me out. I looked around the table. Some members avoided my gaze, while others seemed nervous. They knew the audit was real. They knew what I had found. I folded my arms. That's an interesting motion, Karen, but there's just one problem. I pulled out a copy of the HOA bylaws and dropped it onto the table. Your board can't override a state-mandated audit. The only interference happening here is fraud. A murmur spread across the room. Karen's jaw clenched. And if anyone here votes to block the audit? I continued, letting my voice drop. They'll be investigated too. Because once I file my report, every name on that financial approval list will be under scrutiny. Silence. One by one, the board members refused to meet Karen's gaze. She had lost control. I watched as Karen sat there, her hands tightening into fists. For the first time, she knew she was beaten. But we weren't done yet. Word spread fast. Within days, homeowners started whispering about the audit, the missing money, the fraud. By the weekend, the rumors turned into public outrage. A neighbor, Mr. Holloway, a retired military vet, stormed up to me while I was mowing my lawn. "Is it true?" he demanded. "Karen's been stealing from us?" I nodded. "We have evidence." His face darkened. "That explains a lot. The way she finds people left and right. But somehow her buddies never get violations." He wasn't the only one. A group of neighbors gathered in my driveway that evening. And for the first time, the community united. "We've had enough," Mrs. Thompson said, shaking her head. "We want her gone." "Not just her," another man chimed in. "The whole damn board needs a reset." They weren't just angry. They were ready to fight. And I knew exactly how to help them do it. The next HOA meeting was packed. Homeowners who had never attended before filled every chair, some even standing along the walls. The energy in the room was electric, years of frustration finally boiling over. Karen sat at the front, visibly sweating. The moment the meeting began, I stood up. "We're filing a formal petition to remove Karen as HOA president." She stiffened. You can't just..." "Actually, we can," Mr. Holloway interrupted. He held up a thick stack of signed petitions. "We have enough signatures to force a recall vote, effective immediately." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Karen shot out of her chair. "This is illegal. You can't just..." But her voice was drowned out by the crowd. "Vote her out," someone shouted. "She stole from us," another added. The HOA board members, most of whom had already distanced themselves from Karen, raised their hands in agreement. It was over. By the end of the night, Karen had been officially removed. But there was one last thing left to do. With Karen ousted, I filed my final audit report. Within a month, the state launched a full investigation. And then, the real consequences hit. Karen was officially charged with fraud and embezzlement. The HOA board was disbanded and restructured. New bylaws were put in place to prevent future abuse. The best part? The community took back control. The unfair fines? Refunded. The stolen money? Recovered. The corrupt reign of Karen? Completely destroyed. As I walked past the once intimidating HOA office, now under new leadership, I couldn't help but smile. Because in the end, justice had been served. Karen didn't disappear quietly. After her ouster from the HOA, she vanished for a few weeks, but I knew better than to assume she was gone for good. Then, one morning, I found a legal notice taped to my front door. Cease and desist defamation and harassment claims. Karen was suing me. I stared at the letter, shaking my head. She really thought she could still win. But this wasn't just about me. She was trying to intimidate the entire neighborhood. Others had received similar notices, including Mr. Holloway and Mrs. Thompson. Can she do this? Mrs. Thompson asked when we gathered that evening. "No," I said firmly. "This is a scare tactic. She's hoping we'll back off before the criminal case moves forward." But we weren't going anywhere. Instead, I had my lawyer draft a counterclaim for harassment and filed a report about Karen's retaliatory behavior with the authorities. Karen wasn't just on the defensive anymore. She was spiraling, and soon the courts would see right through her. The trial was a spectacle. Karen, once the queen of the HOA, now sat at the defendant's table, her lawyer desperately trying to argue that she was a real victim. But the evidence? It was undeniable. I took the stand and laid it all out. Heavy checkmarked the fraudulent invoices. Heavy checkmarked the stolen HOA funds. Heavy checkmarked the misuse of power to punish homeowners. Then came the real bombshell. The prosecution revealed bank records showing that Karen had been funneling HOA money into a private account. The same account she used to book a luxury vacation to the Caribbean. The courtroom fell silent. Karen's face turned pale. She knew it was over. And when the judge delivered the guilty verdict, it was the sweetest moment of all. Karen wasn't just fined. She was sentenced to 2 years in prison for financial crimes, along with a permanent ban from holding any position in an HOA or similar organization. Her assets were seized, and the money was returned to the community. But her downfall didn't stop there. Her former allies, the HOA board members who had supported her schemes, weren't spared either. Heavy checkmark, several were forced to resign. Heavy checkmark, some were fined for knowingly approving fraudulent expenses. Heavy checkmark, and at least one faced legal charges for conspiring with Karen. The corrupt HOA regime had collapsed completely, and in its place, a new, fair, and transparent HOA was born. With Karen gone, the community could finally breathe again. The first major change? All unfair HOA fines were revoked. Neighbors who had been wrongly penalized were compensated. A new HOA board was elected, with clear rules in place. Heavy checkmark, no more hidden fees. Heavy checkmark, no more secret deals. Heavy checkmark, every major decision had to be approved by the homeowners. It was no longer Karen's kingdom. It was our neighborhood again. And as I walked through the community, seeing people actually enjoy their homes without fear of HOA tyranny, I knew we had won. One evening, months later, I sat on my porch, sipping a cold drink as I watched a group of kids play on a now freely accessible tennis court. A voice interrupted my thoughts. Mr. Holloway stood at the edge of my driveway, a grateful smile on his face. "You did it," he said. I shook my head. "We did it." He nodded. "Karen thought she owned this place. But you reminded all of us we own it. The HOA had once been a source of control and corruption, but now it was a force for good. And as I watched my neighbors laugh, talk, and live without fear, I knew justice had been served, and the community would never fall into the hands of a tyrant again.